Chapter 2. The Compromise Breached. Know-Nothings, Jingoes, and Uncle Tom. Both major parties sought to banish the slavery issue after 1850. Politicians long habituated to that heady wine sought frantically for a substitute, and some embraced strange and unattractive causes. Heavy immigration in the 1840s had caused apprehension and resentment among Native Americans, especially in the Northeast. A majority of these newcomers were Catholics, and in those states where Calvinist churches were strongest, hatred of Rome rivaled repugnance for slavery. Anti-foreign sentiment was institutionalized in various organizations, such as the Supreme Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. Nativism had already affected elections in pivotal states such as New York and Pennsylvania. Now, in the 1850s, it emerged as a full-fledged party. The American Party, better known as the Know-Nothings, and would enter the presidential contest in 1856. The Know-Nothings also attracted voters not especially interested in nativism who were looking for a political home. Most of these recruits were formerly Whigs, refugees from a party that was disintegrating rapidly after the deaths of Clay and Webster in 1852. The American Party disappeared after 1856, having been destroyed by the force of sectionalism. Then Northern Know-Nothings joined the New Republican Party, which came to be geographically mottled with a selective nativism favoring Protestant immigrants, mainly Germans and Scandinavians, but spurning Catholics, especially the Irish. Another phenomenon of the 1850s was the Young America movement, whose devotees specialized in a tub-thumping jingoistic liberalism. They whooped it up for unlikely causes such as Hungarian nationalism and, in fact, for the liberation of all the peoples behind what might be called the Habsburg Curtain, to say nothing of their demands to annex Ireland and Sicily, and their grandiose dreams of expansion in the Western Hemisphere. Louis Kossuth, leader of the unsuccessful Hungarian Revolution of 1848, was welcomed to the United States with extraordinary enthusiasm. Other Hungarian rebels were offered asylum, such as their descendants would be in 1956. The Young Americans were Democrats, and their program was, to some extent, a response to the Whiggish Know-Nothings. These exotic diversions formed a crust beneath which the fires of sectionalism smoldered and occasionally broke forth. Next to the territorial laws, the most conspicuous part of the 1850 settlement was the Fugitive Slave Act, which is an excellent example of the illusory and elusive character of political issues associated with slavery. To begin with, very few slaves escaped into the free states, although some Southerners believed the number was large. The census of 1860 reported 803 runaway slaves out of a slave population of nearly 4 million. Many were quickly recaptured, others melted into the large free black population in the South, and some voluntarily returned to their masters. Even allowing for twice the number of runaways reported by the census, only a few slaves could have reached the North. The relative and absolute growth of the free black population in the North and in Canada points to the same conclusion, as does research into the number of fugitives apprehended during the 1850s. The law's notoriety was not based on hordes of fugitives or numerous recaptures, but on the propaganda efforts of abolitionists who saw enormous potentialities in the issue. Properly publicized, they contended, even a few attempts to drag helpless blacks into bondage would be worth more than tons of tracts and petitions. As one of them said, "If Ohio is ever abolitionized, it will be by the fugitive slaves from Kentucky. Their flight through the state is the best lecture." Although fugitive slave cases no doubt stirred the hearts of anti-slavery Northerners, hostility to the law, especially in the early 1850s, should not be exaggerated. The congressional debates in 1850 were quite tame, and had it wished, the Northern majority in Congress could have defeated the bill. Neither in 1856 nor in 1860 did the Republican platform call for its repeal. Abraham Lincoln, in fact, was painfully anxious that it not be made an issue in 1860. In the early 1850s, opposition came mainly from abolitionist and free soil strongholds, and by the summer of 1851, even this agitation had subsided. Objection to the law revived when the Missouri Compromise was repealed in 1854, yet it was most intense in those states farthest from the South and least likely to see any fugitives. The famed personal liberty laws enacted by some states were usually intended to prevent kidnapping, not to nullify the Act of 1850. All these facts suggest that the issue was largely symbolic and that it was used effectively for political purposes. The extradition of runaways was even more of a symbolic issue in the South. The Constitution guaranteed the right of recapture. Much of the North seemed to be flouting this requirement. It was argued that concession on a single point, no matter how insignificant, would jeopardize the immediate substantive issue and the whole constitutional structure on which the South depended for protection. Even though few slaves successfully escaped to the North, Southerners were convinced that the right of recapture had to be vindicated, just as the right to hold slaves in the territories had to be upheld, even though few slave owners contemplated going there. Demand for a stringent law was greater in the Deep South, from which few slaves escaped, than in the border states, which suffered most of the loss, indicating that pecuniary considerations were not important. Of course, should Northern hostility ever succeed in seriously undermining the security of property and slaves, the South stood to suffer enormous material loss. Insecurity would drive down the price of slaves. That, in turn, would depress all property values. Needless to say, the South would leave the Union before that could happen. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 provided for the appointment of commissioners to enforce the law, allowed them to require the assistance of local citizens, prescribed fine and imprisonment for anyone helping or attempting to rescue a runaway, excluded as evidence the alleged fugitive's testimony, did not provide for a jury trial, and authorized the commissioners to collect a $10 fee for each prisoner remanded to a claimant and $5 for each one released. The law's critics objected most strenuously to the lack of a jury trial and the exclusion of the prisoner's testimony, claiming that the door had been opened to the kidnapping of free blacks. Extravagant fears of incursions by Southern man-stealers were clearly far-fetched. With 250,000 free blacks in the slave states, it is difficult to see why kidnappers would have gone to the trouble and expense of invading the North to conduct their nefarious business. Southerners replied to the demand for a jury trial by arguing that the Founding Fathers saw the rendition of fugitives essentially as an extradition proceeding. Both subjects were dealt with in the same article and section of the Constitution, 4.2, and both were included in the Federal Act of February 12, 1793, which is almost invariably identified only as the First Fugitive Slave Act. The status of the alleged slave, the argument continued, like that of the alleged criminal, was determined according to the laws of the state from which the slave had fled. As for the exclusion of the fugitive's testimony, that was entirely consistent with the practice in the South and in several northern states that prohibited Negro testimony in cases to which whites were a party. For that matter, defendants in criminal cases had no right to testify in their own defense either in federal courts or state courts. Charges that the fee differential was a bribe to fine for the claimant were answered by citing the additional paperwork involved in such cases, and by pointing out that $5 was a sum altogether too paltry to serve as a bribe. Conflict between Wisconsin's personal liberty law and the 1850 Act led to a Supreme Court decision, Abelman v. Booth, 1859, upholding the constitutionality of the federal law. But to men and women who believed slavery was wrong, law and logic were beside the point. No amount of constitution-studded argumentation could justify delivering the pathetic fugitive into the hands of the slave catcher. And by denying the runaway a jury trial and the right to testify on his own behalf, the Fugitive Slave Act became yet another symbol of the slave power's continuing assault on civil liberties and free government. It was, moreover, the primary inspiration for the most famous novel of the Civil War era, Uncle Tom's Cabin, by Harriet Beecher Stowe. Mrs. Stowe's fundamental concern was morals, not slavery. She did not blame the South alone for slavery. Instead, she endeavored to show that the whole nation was at fault, and that individual slave owners, however humane, could not overcome the inherent cruelty of the system. Such subtleties were lost on the average reader. This was a gullible and unsophisticated age when, as Barnum said, a sucker was born every minute. Sympathetic Northerners who read the story came away with one supreme picture indelibly imprinted on their memories: the death of Uncle Tom at the hands of the arch-villain, Simon Legree. Here was a melodramatic and, to many of that generation, intensely believable portrayal of the South and slavery. Their perceptions sharpened by 30 years of pamphlets, tracts, revivals and speeches, Northerners at last saw the slave power personified. Now they had what every people must have before it can fight a war with gusto: an image of the enemy. A familiar anecdote has President Lincoln saying, when he met Mrs. Stowe, "So here is the little lady who made this big war." She has been compared to Thomas Paine, who helped to prepare the mind of the revolutionary generation for the war with England. Actually, Mrs. Stowe's generation was already prepared, as the extraordinary popularity of her novel proves. She merely helped to stimulate and shape existing emotions: indignation in the North, resentment in the South, the sectional drift. The 1850s witnessed economic and demographic trends far more dangerous to the Union than the Fugitive Slave Act or Uncle Tom's Cabin. Political alliances, whether domestic or international, are based on what is seen as a community of cultural ideals and economic interests. For many years, Southerners had regarded the Old Northwest as their natural ally. As early as the 1780s, Thomas Jefferson promoted the idea of close commercial ties with that section as the basis for an agrarian alliance, a concept later championed by John C. Calhoun. During much of the antebellum period, the South was the major purchaser of northwestern crops and, via the Mississippi, the main avenue to overseas markets. Many Southerners participated in the early settlement of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Then came the construction of the Erie Canal in the 1820s, initiating a shift in the Northwest's orientation that accelerated rapidly with the completion of direct rail connections to the Northeast in the 1850s. During that decade, an ever larger percentage of Northwestern crops found markets in the Northeast or through its ports. Simultaneously, the economy of the Northwest was becoming more diversified, more like that of the Northeast. The same was true of its people. The tide of immigration from New England and the Middle States, reinforced by Germans in large numbers, reduced the settlers of Southern origin to a shrinking fraction of the population, and widened the cultural and ideological gap between the Northwest and the South. Even though the South still had many friends there, the trend was unmistakable. A political realignment was developing that would deprive the South of at least some of its northern allies. As the northern sections drew closer together, the South's sense of alienation and resentment grew keener. Attempts were made in the 1850s to end what many saw as a colonial dependence on the North, develop direct trade with Europe, cut out the expensive northern middlemen, encourage manufacturing, and put the South on the road to economic self-sufficiency. Some slight progress was made in manufacturing. Otherwise, little was accomplished. Resources, expertise, and a sense of urgency all were insufficient to bring about such a sweeping change in the South's commercial relationships. Some Southerners, resenting the incessant criticism that poured across the Mason-Dixon line, also wished to sever social and cultural ties with the North. Already dissension over slavery had split the Methodists and Baptists in the 1840s, and would do likewise to the Presbyterians in 1857. Why not complete the process? Stop visiting summer resorts such as Saratoga. Patronize instead the mountain springs of Virginia. Stop sending young men to Yankee colleges where they were exposed to abolitionism, free-thinking, and other heresies. Educate them at home. If necessary, build Southern universities to keep alive the pure flame of truth, an idea that eventually led to the founding of the University of the South at Sewanee, Tennessee. Stop buying textbooks written and printed in the North. Let Southerners write their own, imbued with their own moral and constitutional principles. These efforts had little success, and the section remained culturally dependent on the North. When the South's psychological declaration of independence did finally come, it resulted from the pressure of direful events instead of from a deliberate choice. In 1852, the Democratic Party nominated Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. one of those men whose enemies called them dough-faces, that is, Northerners who acted like Southerners politically. The platform pledged allegiance to the Compromise of 1850. Otherwise, it merely restated the party's customary dogmas about a small, frugal, and inactive central government. Meanwhile, the Whig Party continued its swift decline. Clay was dying of tuberculosis. His death in July, preceded by only a few months, that of an embittered Daniel Webster, who went to his grave believing he had been rejected by his own people. The Whigs turned to the strategy that had given them their only presidential successes, the nomination of a military hero. Unfortunately for them, General Winfield Scott did not have the frontier glamour of a Harrison or a Taylor, and they were badly divided by the slavery question and weakened by the nativist infestation. Southern members correctly regarded Scott's candidacy as a stalking horse for anti-slavery forces and began to drift out of the party. The Free Soil faction ran its second and last race in 1852, nominating John P. Hale of New Hampshire and adopting the Wilmot Proviso as its platform. Compromise had made the slavery issue temporarily less appealing. Some prominent Free Soilers of 1848, including Martin Van Buren himself, returned to the Democratic fold for the moment at least. Hale received little more than half the votes polled by Van Buren 4 years earlier. Pierce won handily in the Electoral College, but attracted not quite 51% of the popular vote. The protection of that slender majority depended on the continued disarray of the opposition, which in turn depended largely on keeping slavery out of national politics. Slavery and manifest destiny. The expansionist Young Americans saw the election of Pierce as a triumph for their principles, and they were pleased when the new president immediately announced that he was not intimidated by the possibility of further territorial acquisitions. Although he did not openly avow it, Pierce had for his main foreign policy objective the purchase, or at least the liberation of Cuba, one of the last remnants of Spain's once mighty New World Empire. In April 1854, Secretary of State William L. Marcy directed the American minister to Madrid, Pierre Sol, to offer $130 million for Cuba, and if the offer were rejected, to seek to detach the island from Spain. He suggested a conference between Sol, James Buchanan, Minister to Great Britain, and John Wynne Mason, Minister to France. They met first at Ostend, then moved to Aix-la-Chapelle because of the unwelcome publicity they were receiving. There they composed a secret dispatch to the State Department advising that if Spain refused to sell Cuba, and if Cuba became a threat to the internal peace or existence of the United States, it should be wrested from Spain. The acquisition of Cuba would improve relations with Spain, promote a more prosperous commerce, facilitate the suppression of the African slave trade, protect the main route to the Pacific Ocean by way of Central America, and forestall the Africanization of Cuba, thus preventing it from becoming another saint. Domingo, with all its attendant horrors to the white race, and threats to our neighboring shores. This secret dispatch was delivered to Washington by special messenger in November 1854. The Pierce administration rejected its advice for several reasons. One was the fall election losses caused by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, to be discussed later. Despite the dispatch's confidentiality, distorted rumors seeped into the newspapers hinting of an ultimatum to Spain. Sell Cuba, or we will take it by force. Congress asked to see the dispatch. Marcy supplied it and related correspondence, although he deleted his remarks about detaching Cuba from Spain. The wrath of the anti-administration forces, now taking shape as the Republican Party, was heaped on what they called the Ostend Manifesto. They saw the insatiable slave power conspirators once again after land to be exploited by slave labor and more slave states to bolster their already formidable political influence. Filibustering forays against Cuba and Central America, the Gadsden Purchase, and renewed efforts to buy Cuba in 1859 were later represented as parts of the same plot. Like domestic affairs, the foreign policy of the 1850s was refracted through the prism of anti-slavery politics. The evil purpose of the slaveocracy was the all-sufficient explanation for what was done or attempted. The expansionism of the 1850s, far from being a slaveholders' conspiracy, was actually an extension of what had been going on for generations and would continue for generations to come. The colonials had more than once invaded New France. At the end of the 7 Years' War, Benjamin Franklin urged the British to take Canada and expatiated on the advantages of having Mexico and Cuba. During and after the Revolution, Americans regarded the annexation of Canada as being merely a matter of time. As for Cuba, Jefferson, Madison, Gallatin, John Quincy Adams, who announced that the whole of North America rightfully belonged to the United States, Clay, Polk, Douglas, and others were anxious to bring that island within the American orbit. Fear of foreign intentions figured prominently in American designs on Cuba, as it had in the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory, Texas, and the Pacific Coast. The possession of California and part of Oregon gave new strategic and commercial significance to a possible interocean canal. For this and other reasons, American hegemony in Central America and the West Indies was regarded as natural and inevitable. Hegemony was finally achieved, not, however, in the 1850s, when the South was allegedly directing the nation's diplomacy, but 40 years later, when the slave power was just a bad memory. The process began in 1898 under a Republican president from Ohio, and within a decade or so, the United States presided over a network of island possessions, leaseholds, naval bases, protectorates, and client states that stretched from Panama to Puerto Rico. The point is that expansionism was not a sectional phenomenon in the 1850s. The slavery question entered the picture because it served as a rallying cry for rival political organizations. The question was not whether or not to expand, but instead which party or section would reap the profits and the patronage, the commercial and political benefits. Politicians who were out of power naturally did not yearn to see their competitors preside over the creation of this glittering empire. The birth of the Republican Party. When Pierce was inaugurated, 4 states bordered the west bank of the Mississippi: Louisiana, admitted in 1812, Missouri, 1821, Arkansas, 1836, and Iowa, 1846. Population pressure was greatest in the latitude of Missouri and Iowa. West of those states lay an area called Nebraska, or the Platte, extending from the Canadian frontier to what is now the northern border of Oklahoma. It had no formal government. Most of its inhabitants were Indians. Federal authority consisted of a few military posts and Indian agents. Interest in Nebraska grew steadily in the 1840s and early 1850s. There was the usual frontier desire to cultivate virgin soil and to profit from the business and political opportunities offered by a newly opened territory. And after the acquisition of California and Oregon, with their deep water ports, many Americans began to dream of untold wealth to be gained by tapping the fabled markets of the Far East. Connect the Atlantic and Pacific by railroad, and the United States would become a great commercial thoroughfare, the corridor through which all trade between Europe and Asia would pass. It would become the short route to the Indies, fulfilling Columbus's dream. America would be the middleman for the world, which, as Seward and others predicted, it would make over in its own image. There would be a new golden age, a Pax Americana to rival the Pax Romana of antiquity, and it would all be exceedingly profitable. Where would this railroad, this new enterprise of the Indies, be built? Would its eastern terminus be in the north or in the south? The southern route had a distinct edge. It presented fewer engineering problems, especially after the Gadsden Purchase of 1853. More important, it would run entirely through states or organized territory: Louisiana, Texas, New Mexico Territory, California, areas with populations to profit from, support, and protect the railroad, with land that was open to settlement. Northwesterners feared that the Pierce administration, influenced by formidable Southerners such as Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, would adopt the southern route. The best way to enhance the claims of a northern route would be to provide a territorial government for Nebraska, opening it for settlement and making possible federal land grants to help finance the railroad. This immediately raised the question of slavery. Nebraska lay north of the line of 36 degrees 30 minutes, from which slavery had been barred by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Some Southerners had always stigmatized that compromise as an unwise concurrence in the exercise of a power not delegated to the federal government. There were now in Congress powerful Southerners still loyal to the dead Calhoun, who thought to restore their section's equality of rights in the territories by repealing the 1820 prohibition. They also wished to use the question as a test of party loyalty. Pierce had tried to heal the democracy's wounds by bestowing favors on erstwhile Free Soilers who claimed to be good Democrats in 1852. Now they could prove their fidelity by supporting the application to Nebraska of the principle of congressional non-interference adopted in 1850. Among Northern Democrats, the Nebraska question was of particular importance to Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. He had worked for the organization of Nebraska ever since coming to Congress in 1843. It was a matter affecting his own political career and the future of the democracy in his section. It was the essential prelude to the coming of age of the great American heartland, which was fated, said Douglas, to rule the national destiny. As far as slavery was concerned, Douglas told a correspondent late in 1853, all would be willing to sanction and affirm the principle established by the compromise measures of 1850. Indeed, his only alternative would have been to espouse the doctrine of exclusion, that is, to join the Sewardites, Free Soilers, and their sympathizers in the Democratic Party. So for Douglas, as well as for the Calhoun faction, the test of party allegiance was to be congressional non-interference, or popular sovereignty. As it happened, when applied to Nebraska, that meant repeal of the Exclusion Clause of 1820, because without repeal or something equivalent to it, the necessary Southern votes could not be had. The stage was now set for the reappearance of the fatal question. In December 1853, Douglas, chairman of the Senate's Committee of Territories, received a Nebraska territorial bill. It contained no reference to slavery, and hence presented Douglas with a knotty tactical problem. The slightest tinkering with the Missouri Compromise was anathema to the anti-slavery faction. Anything less than outright repeal was considered with suspicion by certain influential Southerners. In this tight spot, Douglas argued that the Compromise of 1850 had substituted popular sovereignty for exclusion and had, at least by implication, made the Missouri Compromise obsolete. The point was, he said, not to introduce or forbid slavery, but to uphold self-rule for the actual inhabitants of the territories. During the early months of 1854, the bill underwent many changes in wording and substance, among the latter being the creation of two territories, Kansas, lying west of Missouri, and Nebraska, adjacent to Iowa. A reluctant Douglas was driven in the direction of outright repeal, although in its final form the bill still hedged somewhat. It declared the 1820 prohibition to be inoperative and void, because it was inconsistent with the 1850 Compromise, and affirmed that the intention of the bill was not to legislate slavery into any territory or state, nor to exclude it therefrom, but to leave the people thereof perfectly free to form and regulate their domestic institutions in their own way. Northern opponents sounded the alarm even before the bill became law. In the celebrated Appeal of the Independent Democrats, Salmon P. Chase of Ohio, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, and other anti-slavery leaders denounced the bill as an atrocious plot to fill the territories with slaves, thus excluding white settlers from the free states and forever blocking a homestead law and a Pacific Railroad. They called on God and all Christians and Christian ministers to aid them in their struggle against the slave power. Their appeal found a quick response. Repeal of the Missouri Compromise touched a raw nerve in the North and set off a reaction far beyond anything Douglas had anticipated. Old Free Soilers, Liberty Party members, abolitionists, disgruntled Democrats, and homeless Whigs began to coalesce as a new, wholly Northern party to oppose the South and its allies. As Douglas put it, the movement was a crucible into which was poured abolitionism, Maine liquor lawism, and what there was left of Northern Whiggism, and then the Protestant feeling against the Catholic and the native feeling against the foreigner. The Republican Party had been born. In odd contrast to this furor, Southerners outside of Congress generally were little interested in the Nebraska question at first, but as the volume of Northern denunciations swelled, The usual defensive reaction took place. What was really at stake? The economic grievances that underlay hostility towards the South have already been described. They were as important as ever. While the Kansas-Nebraska bill was still under consideration, the House of Representatives passed a homestead bill for whites only, Northerners voting 74-3 in favor, Southerners 41-33 against. The Senate amended it to death, and, in August 1854, Pierce took a leaf from Polk's book and vetoed a Rivers and Harbors bill. The appeal of the independent Democrats had stressed just such economic matters. It had also indirectly summoned up Northern hostility toward blacks. Throughout the antebellum North, blacks were discriminated against by law or custom, or both. They were barred from better jobs, segregated in public schools and facilities, confined to ghettos, disfranchised, excluded from some states by law, and regarded as forever inferior to whites in every way. Some Northerners opposed slavery in the territories not only because blacks were slaves, but because slaves were blacks. Abraham Lincoln condemned slavery as well as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but at the same time declared that he had no disposition to interfere with slavery in the South, that he, as well as the mass of Northern whites, opposed political and social equality for free blacks, and that we want them, the territories, for the homes of free white people. Racial prejudice helps to explain why many Republicans preferred containment to abolition. Confining slavery would not merely limit Southern political power, it would keep the blacks, as slaves, in the South. Conversely, abolition would increase Southern political strength by enlarging the basis of representation, and eventually would allow the ex-slaves to move into the North if they wished. Certainly, there were many Northerners, like Lincoln, who were opposed to slavery in principle, but the form their opposition took illustrates how the marriage of ideals and self-interest can make the pursuit of righteousness so rewarding. When emancipation did finally come in the 1860s, it came for reasons no more and no less idealistic than the reasons for opposing the Kansas-Nebraska Act in the 1850s.